The search for the origin of COVID-19 continues, at least for the mainstream media. An article in The Atlantic published this week made the case that there is no evidence strong enough to end the debate over the origins of the pandemic, and that prior beliefs might have a significant impact on people's interpretations.
The writer of the article, Catherine J. Wu, says that each hypothesis that has been proposed, ranging from a spillover from an animal perhaps at a Chinese wet market or from a lab leak, lacks the necessary evidence to prove one hypothesis true over another. Molecular biologist Richard E. Bright tweeted in response to the piece, "Disinformation purveyor behind raccoon dog disinformation campaign doubles down on disinformation." Joining us now to weigh in is reporter at US Right to Know, Emily Kopp. Welcome, Emily.
Hey, great to be here.
So what do you make of this? Do you agree with Catherine's assessment that there isn't enough evidence to rule out every other theory in favor of the lab leak?
Certainly, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to kind of the biggest scientific question of our time and the origins of the worst pandemic in a century. But, I think my issue with this piece is it's sort of a classic in a recent genre where reporters in the mainstream press who have done little to no actual investigative work to uncover the origins of COVID say, well, there's no information, no amount of data that could satisfy either, entrenched side of this debate, so we might as well just give up. We'll probably never know. After basically having done little to no work to help uncover that information. I mean, that's your job if you're in the mainstream press. And I'm a reporter who doesn't have the same sort of institutional support or resources, and I can count probably on one hand the number of reporters doing real digging into the deaths of over 1 million Americans, and there's something very wrong with that. And so I think we've seen this trend recently of reporters with enormous platforms saying, well, we'll probably never know. And I think it's insulting. It's insulting, not only to the people who have been affected by this pandemic, but also there are a lot of great investigative journalists in China. I've recently spent some time reading articles that were deleted by Chinese authorities, and they're excellent. And they cast a lot of doubt on what we know about the origins of COVID. And some of these journalists are spending years in jail. And so I just think this attitude of we'll probably never get enough evidence to satisfy either side is really unfortunate. And I also think we should establish up front here that this initial Atlantic article about raccoon dogs was largely based on a single molecule. So one read of SARS-CoV-2 in one sample among 200 million reads. And probably, making it the most famous molecule of all time. But this second Atlantic article, which is sort of a apology for that fiasco, basically, to my mind, it's really not sufficient.
Yeah, it's weird to me that suddenly people are saying, well, unless you have 100% evidence, then you're not allowed to make any reasonable conclusions. It seems to me like most scientific experts at this point have said the majority of the evidence points to the idea that this did leak from a lab, which raises all kinds of questions about U.S. funding of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, as well as Dr. Anthony Fauci's involvement in that. And I understand that your organization has done some research indicating how Dr. Fauci tried to steer people away from the lab leak theory early on in the pandemic. And I think people need to understand the importance of this, because understanding the origin of the virus could potentially help prevent a future pandemic of this nature, Emily.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's relevant to the raccoon dog fiasco based on a single molecule, because two of the virologists who led that analysis, according to the earlier Atlantic report, are deeply involved with that controversy. They're under congressional scrutiny for possibly misleading the public on a massive scale about this very issue. And so why we're still treating these people as credible and not kind of looking askance at their findings, especially when we don't have any data or analysis. And at the time when we saw all of those raccoon dog headlines, we didn't have any data or analysis to once over their claims. So, I think another kind of point drawing off of what you said is that there's all of this fatalism in the media about not being able to access data and information, but U.S. institutions, including the NIH, were deeply entangled with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And, our organization is trying to access information from China via the U.S. organizations that were involved there. But at the same time, I think that's where a lot of the resistance to investigating this comes from. It kind of has really negative implications for both of the world superpowers, the US and China. So, yeah.
I can't help but think about the moment in time, what was happening in the news and American politics when we saw the narrative come out. It was the first week of April, which I remember as Chinese spy balloon week, where, all of our news was in hysteria. People were in hysteria about this Chinese spy balloon that was floating over the country. That is the same week that we saw mainstream media report, actually, we're sure that this COVID-19 virus came out of Wuhan, China, which was a big change in the narrative from, we're not really sure where it came from. So it happens in Chinese spy balloon week. This was also the time when they were trying to propose banning TikTok as an app and say that China is spying on all of us. They're collecting all of this very valuable data, which is how many hours we spend watching cat videos. I don't know what valuable data is on TikTok or what spying they're worried about. And then they introduce this really big bill that's actually not just about banning TikTok for any kind of public safety against spying from foreign countries. It's really a bill that would give Congress the discretion to ban websites at their, discretion. So we all have a vested interest in knowing where the virus came from, right? It's important for public health. It's important for science and humanity, but we're not seeing resources invested in it. Is the timing a coincidence, or do you see this really as intertwined with the anti-China rhetoric in the United States?
That's a great question. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I will say that the timing is interesting in another way. So the sort of backstory behind this is quite dramatic and fascinating, but essentially this raccoon dog story has really distracted millions of people from the fact that the China CDC, the scientists who did the on-the-ground epidemiology and actually collected the data related to the wet market, came out with a peer-reviewed report in Nature, one of the most famous scientific journals in the world, right around the same time, using the same data, basically saying that the wet market was a super spreader event. And they looked at the same data that the Western virologists were looking at and said, we can't infer an intermediate host, and the pandemic probably started earlier. Well, if you've staked your career on the pandemic starting at the wet market, as these virologists who were involved in, suppressing discussion about the possibility of a lab leak in early 2020 were, that's a big problem for you. And, I don't want to get too wonky, but if you'll follow me here, basically a key pillar of the zoonotic origin theory is the idea that positive environmental samples taken around the wet market tend to cluster around these stalls where they were selling wildlife, like raccoon dogs. And in this, Chinese peer-reviewed report in Nature, they say, in fact, we can't conclude anything from that because we took particular care to sample the wildlife stalls, and we still didn't see any pattern in those samples indicating that the pandemic started in that wildlife. And so again, that's just a real challenge to the sort of mainstream narrative. And it's also a fascinating backstory. I mean, if you want to get really, really wonky, we can talk about the fact that these Western virologists basically stole China CDC data and got locked out of one of the largest genomic databases in the world because they basically disrespected them so deeply. But yeah, it's such a fascinating story. There's a lot of, hype, a lot of faulty claims, a lot of other evidence that we can dig into that is real and not based on one molecule. But it seems like some reporters in the mainstream press are acting more like spokespeople for the natural origin theory than real reporters. So
I wish we had more time to dig into all of this because it is absolutely fascinating, but I hope people will check out US Right to Know to see all of the research that you've been doing. So thank you, Emily. We'll be back with more Rising right after this.